Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Neverending Experiment. This is episode 14, and I'm going to be talking about tarot cards today. So, this is a area where I've done a little bit of study. I got quite into this when I was in my 20s. And I think a big reason why I was so into it was really because I was just so uncertain about the future that I'm now living. And I think prognostication in general is something that I find very interesting. That's when we just try to tell the future. Prognostication, I think, is a little bigger than just fortune telling. It goes into scientific efforts to tell the future as well. It's really common to try to tell the future in science. I mean, people generally really like to be quite confident about what's going to happen in the future. Right now, I think in environmental discussions and even political discussions, a lot of people are very certain about what's going to happen next, and it can be very troubling because we really don't know. Of course, the future will always be unknown until it happens, and the fact is some things are more certain than others. And that goes into the science of probability. So, probability is just determining what is more or less likely to happen of a number of given scenarios. Now, tarot cards are essentially a game. The tarot cards started showing up in Europe in the 15th and 16th century, and they basically have lost the original instructions or intentions or rules for the game. So it's a deck of cards. Of course, our regular playing cards that people use today, a deck of 52, are based on the tarot. So they are sort of a mutation in that lineage of card games. And I'm not sure how far back other card games go, but certainly games of chance and fortune telling are something that have been in our culture for, probably thousands of years. So the tarot cards are interesting because they kind of tell a story. They're all numbered cards. So the main difference between the tarot cards and a regular playing deck today is there are a lot more cards in the tarot. There's also another deck that I had for a while called the Minchiette, and that's a Florentine deck that came out a little bit after the tarot that actually has, I think, 96 cards. It's got a lot of cards. And the regular tarot cards have, I think, 78. So the tarot cards are a game basically where you try to apply these different cards, all parts of a story, kind of an unknown story. It's not totally clear what's happening in the cards. It's just clear that there is a process and an order. So they're all numbered. Of course, just like the regular playing deck, you've got 1 to 10. In the tarot, they call that the minor arcana. And each suit contains 14 cards. So, of course, in a regular playing deck, we only have the minor arcana, and there are 13 cards. So they got rid of the page card, or in some decks, it's the maiden, and they kept that down to 3. So in the regular deck, you've got king, queen, jack, and in the tarot, you've got king, queen, knight, and page. The only card in the regular playing deck, of course, that's in addition to the regular cards is the Joker. And the Joker is basically like the leftover of the major arcana, and that would be the Fool card. So the Fool is number 0 in the major arcana. Most of them go to the World, which is 22 cards. So 22 cards in the major arcana, 14 times 4, 56. So 56 plus 22 is 78. So there we go. 78 cards in a regular tarot deck. In my tarot deck that I have here that I'm using right now, there's 2 extra cards. And today you're going to find hundreds of different tarot cards that are available. They are beautiful works of art. A lot of different artists get into doing tarot cards. I know I started doing some digital images that I thought maybe I'll turn into a deck. I never did. I never went that far with it, but I know some people that have made their own tarot decks, and they can be just really amazing, artistic creations. So the line between game, art, and fortune telling in tarot is pretty blurry. It involves all of those different things. And I think the main goal with tarot, if you're going to be telling the future or even telling the present, because a lot of times that's really what it is the more you show about what all these different themes and events in life are, the more broad that is, the more likely you are to hit on some real events in life, and you're matching them up with things that could happen to you and themes and people that you're likely to meet or run into. So the major arcana also includes the face cards. Now the face cards, this is the same in the playing deck, are the people. And so usually when you get a face card, that means that it's a real person. Most of the time, not always. Now, the major arcana are what we would call archetypes. That's something that Carl Jung started to talk about and develop that idea of the archetype. An archetype is basically like a overarching idea of a certain type of person or theme or energy. Now, a lot of that will be a person, but it could be also a part of nature. For example, there is the sun, the moon, the world. In this deck, we've got the artist and the well, which is pretty interesting. The well, it's kind of like the depth of the subconscious. Now, one of the biggest things that's so interesting about the tarot card is the elements. Now, elements, and I'm not talking about the table of elements, which is the scientific breakdown of all the different materials, basic molecules on Earth, but the elements in traditional thought would be water, air, earth, fire, and there are different variations on that as well, and they're found in pretty much every culture. I think every main culture that I know of, they're very prominent. The four elements are very prominent in Native American culture. I know in Chinese medicine, there's usually 5 elements. I know in Ayurveda medicine in India, they also use elements and they divide people into different categories based on these elements. And even in normal life, I think you'll meet people that seem to be behaving in a certain way that is related to an element like fire. I mean, we all know what a fiery temperament is. Someone who, is very excitable, is very energetic. At the same time, there are people that are more watery, people that are into often the arts and feelings, and the people that are air tend to be more thought oriented, maybe writers, maybe today, I think we're living in a time that is more air focused. So the nerds and the geeks of the world, that's sort of the air world. So we have all these different basic ways of seeing the world through the elements. And in science too, there is the states of matter, which I think are very connected to that. The traditional elements point to the basic components of our environment that we all experience. And of course, there's the fifth element, and that is sort of the origin or the ether or kind of the idea of space, where there maybe are no elements, but yet we're affected by empty space quite a lot. That's the basis of where this came from. And so if you look at the different suits, the difference with the regular playing deck is in the tarot, we have pentacles instead of diamonds. That's the earth element. We've got cups instead of hearts, which is the water element. We've got swords instead of spades, which is the air element. And we've got wands, which is connected to clubs, and that is the fire element. So all of these different elements, you can see how then you would put together different kinds of personalities from the face cards. And then, of course, there are the 1 to 10 minor arcana, the basic cards, and unlike the playing card deck, of course, there are beautiful images all over the minor arcana. And they all tell stories. It's easy to sort of follow a certain logic with the stories. They're not real stories in the sense of having the same character. It's more that feeling of like choose your own adventure, that you're going through these different processes of life and one thing follows another. And the positive and negative is a really big part of tarot. And I think that's the biggest thing for me, where I've realized that it's not that easy to tell what's positive and negative, even though there are obviously scary cards like the Devil and Death, and there are also seemingly very positive cards like the Lovers or the Sun. But there are dark sides to every positive and there are light sides to every negative. Sometimes in life, there are negative things that you simply have to go through, and just avoiding the negative isn't necessarily always an option. So, the way I see tarot cards now, I think I definitely put a lot less faith in them overall based on what I went through in my 20s. I think that I was overly eager to really believe that there was a specific future that I needed to have, or that, there's the perfect soulmate that I was meant to be with. And I think the danger of getting too far into any kind of fortune telling, whether it's scientific or not, is when you lock yourself into a specific expectation. And that can happen even, I think, subconsciously, whether you're trying to tell the future or not. A lot of us are trained since we're very young to expect a certain kind of future. So a lot of us have an expectation of what our future will be, whether or not we've really tried to figure out what it's going to be. Now, on the other hand, the other extreme sort of other side of how you might approach your future is just that you're gonna create your future and that's it. You're gonna make it happen, you're gonna do what you want and that's it. And I think both of those approaches, whether you're completely fatalistic or completely active, like you're bound to run into difficulties and you're bound to run into disappointments. It's just how it is. So the tarot card I think is interesting. If you see life as a game, I think that makes the tarot cards make more sense. Life is a game, the tarot is a game. It's all mysterious. Nobody knows what the rules are, so we're just trying to sort of make it up and figure it out and share that information. So I did take a course in the tarot and I learned a lot through that. And how I use the tarot now is really not that often, but I would say pretty regularly. And I think it's one of those things you come to when you just don't know what's going on and you're really not sure what's happening next. I know I've had a lot of that over the last year, waiting for my book to come out and just living with so much uncertainty. And the nice thing about the tarot is that it has these really broad themes that can just bring insight. And I would say that definitely more than telling the future, I would say that providing insight is really what is great about the tarot and what's great about a lot of the other esoteric things out there. Same with astrology. It is fuzzy because that's what it is. When you're dealing with complex, abstract narratives, you're dealing with things that you can't easily separate one from another. If you want to have the prize at the end, you may have to go through a bunch of other things, including sacrifice, including difficulty. It doesn't give you any tricks out of going through the regular difficulties of life. And it doesn't necessarily lock you into to bad things either. I think one of the funny things that people do that I've noticed and that I've done is when you don't get the answer you want right away from the tarot, then you go back and you shuffle the cards and you do it again and you do it again, looking for that answer that you want. And eventually you'll find different cards. But what is interesting to me that I've found is that the same cards really do seem to come up for certain issues. And it's not always clear what they mean. Now, because every tarot card is a little work of art, is a little painting, it's complex. And interpreting art is complex and multi-layered, and different people will get different things out of it. One individual card could have a whole bunch of different colors on it. Here's one of the scary ones, right? The tower. The tower card is considered to be, traumatic. It's similar to some of the images of this look an awful lot like the Twin Towers when that happened, when 9/11 happened. It is a person falling from a tower. And some of them have smoke and fire coming out of it as well. So this ancient image from the 15th century can turn into a real life event. Now, I've had a number of different decks, and I think it's fun to try different decks because each of them has different themes. And sometimes those little elements of what's really going on can be a surprise. Like I said, sometimes it's a small image in one of those cards that makes you connect to something that's going on. I remember I was going on a road trip to see my grandmother, and I got one of the cards was the Chariot, which of course the Chariot is the precursor to a car. And another card, there was a Native American theme in that one, and there was an image of a bunch of buffalo. And now when I go to see my grandmother, we go through a national park that's full of buffalo, and you can usually see some bison on the way. Little things like that that aren't obvious, that may not be a by the book interpretation of what those images are. It's art. It's art, and art is life. Life reflects art. Art reflects life. So that's how that is from my perspective. I'm probably a little less sacred about the whole thing. I know some people are very, very protective of the energies in their cards. And I mean, they are often very nice cards. If you start to damage the cards, it makes them useless, really, for any kind of game, because part of what is so important in the tarot cards is that element of probability. All of the cards are identical on the back, so you don't know what they are. So it's accessing this part of you that is subconscious. So how it's done is generally either the person asking the question, whether you're doing it for yourself or if you're doing it with a tarot card reader, usually what they will do is get you to shuffle the cards yourself while you are thinking about the question that you want to ask. And it can be a very general question. It can be just about how your life is going in general, or it could be a very specific question about a relationship or about a career or so on. So there are a lot of different spreads that you can use. Obviously, those that have been developed over time with tradition. You can develop your own so long as you know what the spread is going to be before you put it down. You are trying to find an answer to something without purposefully selecting it yourself. So you're using your subconscious by shuffling the decks without seeing what the cards are, just like you would in a regular game. Eventually they will wear out. I've worn out probably 5 or 6 decks, maybe more over my life. I've had quite a few. These ones I got about 3 or 4 years ago. This is the Ethereal Visions Illuminated Tarot deck, and it's a very aesthetically pleasing one. I mostly got it because it was nice. It looked nice. And there's just all kinds. Matt Hughes is the artist of the one, and it's got an Art Nouveau kind of look to it. I love Art Nouveau. So that's the card deck I'm using now. The outcome of what you get will really depend on the card deck. So what I wanted to do, I was going to do an actual little reading right now, an easy little spread. And it's just as a test to see and to show you like what it's like to try and figure out the future. Because once we publish this, and then I can come back over the next year. I decided to do this now because it is the new year, and it's a time of laying out plans for the future and figuring out what's going to happen next and what the energy of the next year is. What I would say overall and how I use it is that, like I said, I use it for insight. I have had so-called positive cards that have ended up being situations that I would consider to be negative. I have had so-called negative cards that have ended up being very positive situations. So I would always say, don't only rely on the tarot. Whatever you do, you have a life, you have your own intuition within you, your own gut instincts. So always put that first, and I would never ever recommend going against your own feelings and intuition. Just because the tarot cards gave you that answer, remember that sometimes you do have to go through negative things. I do a little shuffle right now, so a lot of times in these sort of esoteric worlds, you kind of go away from what you would normally do when you're trying to be rational. A lot of people will use the left hand for a lot of things. Obviously, in traditional religion, they would say the left hand is the hand of the devil. But I think for more intuitive people, the left hand is really the more feminine side and the more creative side. And so it's not a bad thing. I definitely do not believe that. Well, I don't believe in the devil, for one thing. I see the devil as an archetype. Fool doesn't know what's going on. The fool steps out into what seems to be a cliff with his little dog, his little intuitive dog, and we don't really know what happens to him after that. Well, there's obviously other cards after that, so we can assume the fool doesn't just jump off the cliff and die, but there's that element of the unknown. The fool doesn't know anything. So anyway, so some people are very, very sacred about their cards, and they will put them in velvet, and they'll put them in a special box, and get like very, very careful about how they take their cards out and what kind of energies are influencing the card. I'm a little more rough with it. Like I consider my culture to include science, so that's why I don't really get caught up in the ceremonial, and I think that's just sort of my comfort level of my own sort of cultural background. I think, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, that I was raised Roman Catholic. I know I am going to do a podcast soon about religion, and just to go over sort of what my feelings are about religion. I know a lot of religious people are taught to be afraid of things like the tarot and astrology. They're taught that these things are bad, and that's because they involve older cultures. It is a form of, I don't want to say racism, but it is a form of profound cultural prejudice. And just that it became associated with certain underclass. I think a lot of it became associated with Gypsy or Romani culture, who were known for some more esoteric activities. So I'm going to do a reading of 5 cards. This is a really basic spread, and it's just past, present, future, and then the 2 cards that are basically like kind of advice. So I'm going to do this for myself just to show an example and just to test it out and see, is this going to show me what the next year is going to be about? So obviously the present is now at the beginning of the year. We can assume that the future will be potentially the next year or even into the future beyond that. And the past is whatever has been coming into play that's influencing what's happening right now. And so hopefully this next year we'll see some big changes. That's what I'm hoping for. But looking at the world and how crazy it is, who really knows what's going to happen? As much as you try to plan out your own life, we're all influenced by those big things happening out there in the world. So usually, and this is what I was taught, is to actually cut the card deck after you shuffle it and choose one of the piles with your left hand. So I've got that all figured out, and so let's try it. So we're gonna go past, present, future, and then 2 cards to show what kind of advice the cards are gonna give me for what to do over the next year. Okay, so past, the Lovers. Maybe this is some romantic life stuff happening. Oh, present. 4 of Cups, disappointment. Yeah, I'm single right now, so I would say that that's true. And future, oh my goodness. Oh my goodness, what's the future gonna be? 7 of Cups, illusions, mystery. I don't know, you guys. What's happening? Advice is the Emperor. Oh my goodness. So the Emperor is in control. The Emperor is probably the most masculine and dominant of all of the cards. And that's the advice for me. And the second card is the Queen of Cups, which is a very intuitive, emotional card. So that's interesting to have those cards together, because the Emperor is the advice for me. And these other cards are showing, oh my goodness, the Lovers, the 4 of Cups, the 7 of Cups. So that's not giving me like a really great vision, but who knows? And like I said, sometimes it's negative, but that doesn't mean that it's bad, that it's bad things are going to happen. It just means you have to go through some confusion. And the 7 of Cups is all about confusion. The 7 of Cups is about having all these different options and you don't know what to do. Now this card in this deck is particularly interesting. I'm going to try and hold it up here. If you are able to watch the video with this, maybe you can see. You can see there is a guy there holding a mask and holding a skull. And there is a reptile down below and some snakes as well. Ooh, very mysterious. So that's interesting. So I don't know, it's almost looking like some lover from the past. I don't know who that would be or what that means. Someone that was disappointing and is going to be confusing again. But the advice is pretty strong, right? The Emperor is about taking control of your life, and the Queen of Cups is about being emotional and sensitive. So even though those are quite different cards, they're both in control, right? The Emperor and the Queen are royal cards. So we'll see. It's an interesting reading. I don't know what to tell you, people. Who knows? We will see. It's January 2025, so we'll see. I'll come back to this episode in a year or even at the end of the year and go over it and just see what kind of insight that may have provided. And so I'm not going to cry about the 7 of Cups or the 4 of Cups. The 4 of Cups is disappointment and almost like apathy. That's probably how I'm feeling right now. So a lot of times relationship stuff will come up as emotion as the cups. So a little bit about the experiences I've had in the past. I spent a lot of time recording a lot of readings to see what kind of patterns there were. And I did find certain cards seemed to come up predominantly at a certain time, and then a different card would start to become more common. And sometimes you can do that. You'll shuffle the deck and shuffle the deck, and the same cards come up again. And it can be very strange. And I think that that is sort of that element of like, okay, there is something to it. I read an interesting article by someone who was studying the tarot, and they said they have been studying it for decades, looking for the answers for how it works, and they were still working on it. So it's just part of the mystery of life, I think, to do this kind of thing, to wonder about the future, to look for signs. I definitely follow signs, but again, you have to really be in the moment and not get too caught up in one single interpretation of what something means. And I think that's the danger that people get into with tarot, and probably where there's all this fear about it going badly. So one of the expectations, and a lot of people talk about that, is self-fulfilling prophecy. The self-fulfilling prophecy is that you believe a certain outcome will happen and therefore you make it happen. Well, in my experience, I haven't found that to be the trouble with tarot. I think the trouble that I've had with it has more to do with it just not happening. When you think something positive is going to happen and then it doesn't happen, that is so disappointing. And I have had that because I was just like, I need to understand this. I need to understand how I got so caught up in a certain outcome, and I was trying to make it happen and it still didn't happen. And so it was wrong. Sometimes I get it wrong. So yeah, the tarot can definitely get it wrong. We'll see. If you haven't tried tarot cards, I think it's fun. I think it's interesting. You just have to remain detached from the outcome, and you have to remain detached from what it's telling you. Like I said, I've had positive outcomes from negative cards, and I've had negative outcomes from positive cards. So getting a negative card today doesn't bother me too much. The Seven of Cups is actually kind of a cool one. There's a lot of symbolism in there with the skull and the mask and the reptile and the snakes. Those are things that are very interesting to me, and I've written a lot about snakes and dreaming of snakes. I think there is a connection between the snakes and our DNA. And as far as reptiles go, I mean, that's also in our ancient ancestry. Our ancient ancestors were reptiles. We have all evolved as human beings from reptilian ancestors because they were the original animals. So an interesting evolutionary background. So that's reaching deep into the DNA and into the subconscious and the illusory world of the subconscious. And these are illusions as well. Everything is an illusion. Ethereal visions. That's very much what it is. It's not concrete, but it is emotional, and it is part of how our minds work. Our minds are fast moving, complicated, not just one organ, right? Our DNA is influencing our brain as well, and how we perceive things and how we feel things. Because it's not just about thoughts, but it's also about feelings. The swords and the cups, and I think that also the elemental part of the tarot and of these esoteric traditions, I think, are really helpful. And I think that I kind of wish we would acknowledge them even more, because I think that we get thoughts and feelings to mix up together, and they are different. Our thoughts are kind of what's going on in our brain, and our feelings are going through our whole body. I think that, learning about these elements and learning about the esoteric traditions can be helpful in that sense, because it helps you understand how you're feeling and thinking, and how those two are subtly different within yourself. And the fire element too, right? The fire element is often connected to motivation and excitement and energy. So again, all of these things happening within our bodies. And it's easy for us to differentiate the earth element because it's solid and you can see it. But those other elements are also inside of us. And I think in today's world, we don't really acknowledge that. And there's a lot of talk about mental health, but I think really what we're mostly talking about is emotional health and spiritual health. That's the fire element. So I think that understanding those subtle differences within yourself between thoughts, feelings, motivations, I think that can be really helpful because then it helps you to be less confused. And maybe that will help me be less confused in the next year when we see what sort of 7 cups of unknown elements come into my life. So I wish you all the best in this new year. Happy New Year to everyone out there. I'll be back in a couple weeks. I think maybe next time I'll try and talk a little about religion. So hopefully that cleared some things out if you're wondering about the tarot cards. Yeah, don't take it too seriously. Have fun with it. Because, yeah, it's a game and life is a game. And so are the tarot cards. Thank you. This has been the Never Ending Experiment. This is Kim Anderson.